Hey folks, Phil Strout here. I want to welcome you back to the class on heroic leadership with the Vineyard Institute. And over the previous 3 weeks, we have been going into this material and particularly understanding the influence and some of the thoughts of Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, in relationship to leadership. And what we had talked about the first week, I introduced and gave somewhat of an apologetic of why we're using the word heroic and why we believe that it's, in a sense, it's a bit of a discipleship statement in a world, in a culture that is celebrating more and more the underachiever and anyone that differentiates from the crowd and crowdthink is ostracized or ridiculed, and you've heard the famous "Who do you think you are?" and to combat some of that, we just said, the actual word, the word heroic, just simply means having courage, and it's our deepest conviction that to lead in the world today, in the church, and or lead at our homes, or lead at the office, or lead at the school, or whatever your reality is. In order to do that, you're going to need an incredible baptism of courage. And instead of underselling that, we absolutely, we've put it right up front. So it's a little bit different type of leadership, as you've already experienced in the first 3 classes, where we're introducing phrases that usually aren't used in leadership courses, and it's designed that way. Also, the first night we talked about self-awareness, that basically there's a very, very important question that an Ignatius, through the spiritual exercises, basically would work with novitiates and bring them to the place of saying, who am I and what am I about? And in order to discover that, he wrote out these spiritual exercises that are done in the context of the original material over a 30-day period when somebody is in that sense, doing it in retreat. So it's not just a matter of sitting around contemplating who you are, but it's working through a set of contemplative exercises and asking for revelation. So we talked about that. And then in the second week, we went into Ignatius, and where did he come from? He was from the Basque country of northern Spain. He was a warrior. He was part of the army. He was defending Spain. He was critically injured in a battle defending Pamplona, and he goes on and he ends up having an incredible experience with God. And we said that he not only had this ecstatic, supernatural, in-breaking experience with the future age, but that Ignatius also, by his own confession, this is what he said, that he had such a supernatural experience that he learned more in a revelation. He learned more in a supernatural download in this little town called Manresa, that he said he learned more in 24 hours than he learned in the rest of his life. Now, and as I said in that class, I said, at my house, that counts as a supernatural experience. So he was not, and I also said, this is why it goes so much hand in glove with the vineyard, because we are a people who believe in the supernatural. We believe in the inbreaking of the kingdom of God. We believe that the future age has invaded the present age in the person of Jesus Christ. We believe that, and then we also know, but this walk is to be walked out, this Christian pilgrimage is to be walked out over all the years that we're on the earth. So it not only is the ecstatic, but it is also the routine. It is not only a supernatural act of God, it's also just the disciplines, and thus the words that we would use, spiritual disciplines, or as Ignatius wrote, the spiritual exercises. And I know many of you are reading that in your material, and many of you took with Steve Summerall, you've taken a course in Vineyard Institute on spiritual formation, and I probably did a number of contemplative exercises, and so I'm not going to rehash that. That was for that. This I'm just helping you understand that. But I'm not so tied in so much to the spiritual formation piece of it I am trying to extract some of the leadership principles that Chris Lowney has written about in this excellent book, Heroic Leadership. I hope you're enjoying it as much as I have. I'm in my 9th time reading through it, and it's probably one of those books that I'll just keep with me the rest of my life. And it hasn't replaced the Bible, just in case you're worried about that, or if I quote, but this is a course on leadership. We're using that as a textbook, so I'll quote from that, and as you have realized in the class, I'm also reading. And let me just take a 2-minute window here and just explain why, Phil, this is the Vineyard. Why are you using a Jesuit who is a Catholic religious order? Why are we using their material? Well, let me just tell you why. Because it's brilliant. And I cannot explain to you, because it's not the purpose of our time together or the course, but I have hundreds of books on leadership in my library. And I just say this. This material was so fresh, and it so ignited and reignited this whole conviction of that God puts something in us, in the sense of, I use the word chip. You're not going to find that in the material or anything like that, but just using the vernacular of our day, it's a chip. There's something that happened in these young men under the influence of Ignatius and under the influence of these spiritual exercises and the daily routine of healthy examine, that this is the material that has shaped the second part of my life and this, at this point in my pilgrimage as a leader. The third week we covered real quickly, we went over motivation. Now, this is what basically Ignatian put out in play, and through which he would filter almost all activity, and he would say, all things are done to the greater glory of God and the well-being of people. And it's nothing more than when the lawyer asked Jesus, what's the most important thing? He said, love God and love people. Ignatius just simply said, we do all things for the greater glory of God, to make God famous, and in that process it also does well to the people. So he was always speaking of the well-being of the people. One of the biggest things, and what we're going to start on this week, it's a big deal, and that is, as we go through this material, I want to continually come back to what it is that we are really on the inside. When nobody's looking, not when we're in a pulpit, or not when we're teaching a class, not when we're actually leading. What is on the inside? And I'd like to introduce and talk a little bit about this phrase, Modo De Proceder. It's just a Spanish way of saying how we do things. This is our mode of, or we would say in the world, a mode of operandi. This is the way we do things. And it became basically a clarion call, a call in the Jesuit mindset. They didn't have to think about what would Jesus do or what would St. Ignatius do. They worked so long and so hard at the core of their being that they just said, this is the way we roll. And it's a very interesting thing. Let me just read, if you want to open your books. I want to look at page 20 because it's sort of the introduction of this. I'm going to list out some of the places in the material. If you want to look at another time, you can note it in your notes. Page 127, page 245, and then there's an extended explanation of Modo De Proceder on pages 249 to 250. But basically what he's saying is, this is the way we operate, okay? And we'll get to where that comes from in a few minutes. But let me read this part. Leadership, on page 20, says, leadership is not a job. It's not a role one plays at work and then puts aside during the commute home in order to relax and enjoy real life. Rather, leadership is the leader's real life. Boy, catch this. If you're at the front end of your career in leadership, in any genre, any niche, whether that's in education or medicine or mechanics or in the church or missionally, Leadership is not a job, not a role one plays at work and then puts aside during the commute home in order to relax and enjoy real life. Rather, leadership is the leader's real life. The early Jesuits referred often to nuestro modo de proceder, our way of proceeding, or in the way we do things, or the way we roll, if we really want to use the vernacular of today. Certain behaviors fit the way we do things. Others didn't. No one ever tried to capture nuestro modo, our way, in writing, because no one could have and no one needed to. Our way of proceeding flowed, this is a brilliant way to explain this, our way of proceeding flowed from a worldview and priorities shared by all members of the Jesuit team. Their way of proceeding was a compass, not a checklist. They didn't put their finger in the air and catch the wind and decide, how are we going to lead right now? They weren't looking at the political poll and seeing what boxes were being checked off. They could only lead from their inside. May I just put a word here to people in leadership and contemplating leadership. This is a big, big, big deal, and I'm going to cover it in this class after, because this is the biggest, these are the big deals of formation of leadership. If you know where you're heading, the compass is an infinitely more valuable instrument. And so it was for the Jesuits. Thrown into, and he's giving an example here, thrown into China's unfamiliar cultural terrain, a Jesuit found that the checklist of tactics, the way we do, just if we're going to have a methodology, think we're talking 16th and 17th century. There had never been any work in China in this context. They didn't have a checklist of methodology and things, oh, well, we have to do this and do that and do this and do that because that's the way we did it in Europe. You know, we think oftentimes when I hear young people talk about contextualization in ministering in different contexts around the world, this has been a challenge for centuries. And instead of having a checklist or a fixed methodology, it says that these guys, instead of having a checklist of tactics that worked in Europe, was useless to him in this foreign land, but his compass, his way of proceeding served him well. By knowing what he valued and what he wanted to achieve, he oriented himself to the new environment, adapting confidently to unfamiliar circumstances. You get it? He didn't have, and he's talking about Francis Xavier there, but what he didn't have to do was trying to, what's acceptable right now? A leader that has paid the price in the hard work and walking this out and asking tough questions of oneself. Who am I and what am I about? What do I actually, how was I formed on the inside? Now, let me share a couple of personal pieces of this. About 5 years ago, I was asked to write a paper on my philosophy of leadership. But not only what was my philosophy of leadership, but how was that philosophy formed? Why do I lead? And I was asked, how will you lead? Where will you lead us? And what formed that? So what it did, it made me do a bit of inventory. I took inventory of the previous close to 40 years of leadership. And I went back and I've saved notebooks and I've articles that I've written and teachings that I've done. And I actually went back and got some cassettes. Most of you wouldn't even know what that is, but some of you will. If you do, that ages you a little bit. But I just went back and I actually did a research on my own work because I was asked to do this. It was a fascinating exercise. It took me almost the entire summer of 2011. But what I found was that I actually had only preached 3 different sermons in 40 years. And that's a true statement. What I found was that I had talked over and over and over and over and over and over and over in the context of what was really inside, what was in the core, what was actually there. What did I believe in? And it really was a fascinating thing in finding that I basically had been talking about the presence of God, the proclamation of the gospel, and practical things that you do to get traction as a church. And you would think, really? After 40 years, those are the only 3 sermons you know about? But it actually was. Now, those were contained in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. I mean, think about it. Preaching and teaching 3, 4, 5 times a week, teaching classes in Bible institutes, things like that. Literally, we're talking of hundreds and hundreds, several hundred talks about 3 things. The presence of God and all that is encompassed in that. We could talk about intimacy, the secret life, all of that. But really, what are we talking about? The presence of God in our life and the presence of God. And in 1,000 different ways, encouraging us to be an outward people, proclaiming the gospel, living the good news. But it really boiled down to nothing more than evangelism/discipleship. The proclamation of the gospel, bringing the word of God to a lost world. And then hundreds of talks just on practical things you do to connect with people and how churches operate. But I can honestly say, in writing that, when I got done, I realized I'm probably not going very far off the trail for the next 30 years. If I have another 30 years, I decided I'm pretty well vested with that. So I don't have to think now so much about what do I have to do. Now, there's been other times, and I was going to share one with you because we're talking about what happens on the inside. Why do you do the things you do? How you can only lead from who you really are. We were going to plant a church in 1993, and it was the second church that Jane and I and a group of other people were in the process of planting, and I wasn't quite sure everything we wanted to do, but I knew it was like, man, you're only going to get to do this once. You're only going to get to plant this church once. What do we really want to do? I want to plant a church. I want to form a church that I really want to go to. I guess that's what you get to do when you plant a church. You get to plant a church in the type of church that you want to go to. So I went away, and if you remember in a couple of classes ago, I took a legal pad with me and just 1,000 questions. And I went away, and I spent 4 or 5 days at a friend's condominium at a ski resort, and I just sat there and wrote. And I wrote about 66 pages. This is what I want to do. This is what I believe. This is the core. This is the core. This is what I want to do. And I know that you can't have a 66-page mission statement. You can't say in 3 sentences. You've got to be able to say in 3 sentences, what are you about? So I worked at it, boiled it down, and I came down to 5 statements. And this was what we formed the church around. Here they were. Be loved, believe, be healed, be equipped, and be going. Now, this was 22, 3, 4 years ago. Now I look back, and when I did this exercise in 2011, I look back and realized that was the core. The presence, be loved, be healed, or be loved, believe, be healed, be equipped. The practical pieces, and be going. The missional proclamation of the gospel. Now, I didn't set out to build a slogan. That was just what happened. I realized that no matter how we did this, and that became basically the filter of everything I taught in the 8 or 9 years that I was the pastor of that church. It was always circling one of those things. And if I couldn't answer the question, how does what we're doing relate to what we say we're about? We're about people experiencing the love of God. We're about faith, believe. We're about healing. What brings more healing than the presence of God? We're about equipping the saints, the practical things you have to do to get traction and be going. It wasn't be gone. Actually, when we started, we wrote be gone. We realized that's a little final, so we used the gerund, and it had a little implication of coming and going. We weren't shooing people off. We also knew that as a young church plant, we couldn't do everything. We could not compete with the supermarket churches in the city we were planting in. We knew we couldn't keep up. We knew that we couldn't offer everything, so we just decided to rid ourselves of the tyranny of large church demand. And basically what we said, and from the core, we just simply said, no, we can't do everything, so we're going to do a decent worship service. We're going to be incredibly kind to children, and we're going to have small groups. We're not going to start women's groups, men's groups, youth groups, teen groups, this and that. None of it. For 24 months, moratorium. Nobody can start any new ministries. We're going to do good worship. We're going to really be kind to the little guys, the little children, and we're going to meet in small groups. That helped us out. We had so often people coming and saying, well, we have 3 teenagers. We'd come to your church if you had a teen meeting, and I'd give them a list of the 5 best churches in the city and say, I know every one of those churches has a youth group, and I would recommend, if that's what you need, you got to go there, because we're not doing that for another year and a half. And we just stuck with that. That wasn't trying to read the moment, because the moment actually would have dictated start everything, because whatever people ask for, if you give it to them, they'll then come. That's not leading from the core. Now, in the material, you will remember that in 1540, when this band of 10 men, when they started, within 30 years, they had literally hundreds of high schools all over Europe. There was a demand, an incredible demand. And it just snowballed on them, so much so that intuitively you would have said they need to lower the bar to get more people to come in to be a Jesuit, because then we could actually meet the demand of the day. So common sense would say, well, just lower the bar and forget, the big thing about the spiritual exercises and the novitiate. And Ignatius said, never, 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 never. We will not lower the bar. We will not now just make an easy way into our religious order just so we can answer the clamor of the day. What was he doing? He was saying, this is the way this is the formation. If people are going to do this all over the world, that he understood, and this is part of that revelation, he understood the need of a true interior compass. This is a very big concern I have for leaders, for pastors, is to be led by their interior life, the true conviction where it's at their core. What they do is at their core. The way you run if you're a little league coach, the way you coach is at your core. If you own a small business, the way you treat customers, that's at your core. That will always win the day over the latest and the greatest. Now, here's my concern, and I've expressed this in so many different settings, but I want to put it in this material, that pastors are bombarded with the latest and the greatest in methodologies and the new thing. And you look at magazines, Charisma Magazine, Christianity Today, Leadership Journal, Outreach, Relevant, and it's like, first, you read the first quarter magazine and it's all about this, and then the second quarter magazine, it's all about that, and then the third quarter, it's all about that, and pastors just zigzag in and out of what they're bringing to their churches, because what they're doing is they're basically trying to build churches, lead churches, or lead according to the latest and the greatest coming from the fanciest and the newest congregations. That is a tyranny that I long for the day to see our young leaders and see our leaders in our middle age and our sages not led by the latest and the greatest of things, but actually paying the price. And we've talked about this in our other class, that Christian formation, the Christ being formed in us, lasts a lifetime, so that people are actually leading from the inside, leading from, and what they do is actually theirs. They own it. You own it. Boy, if I could look you all in the eye right now, I would say if I could bring anything to you in the heroic leadership class, it's this whole thing of the conviction of who you are, where you're going, how that happens, the Modo De Proceder, how you roll, how you actually do things. And that once you have that, trust it. If you and the Lord and you with your community, you have co-discerned that, and you've walked that through in spiritual contemplation and prayer and meeting with God in the secret place, etc., then you're going to do fine. You will anchor yourself in your values. You'll anchor yourself in your core beliefs. These things become convictions. Why do we believe in spiritual formation? Why do we believe in developing a secret life and spiritual disciplines? Why do we believe in proclaiming the gospel? Why do we believe in practical things and how you treat people? Let me just say this. For me, and probably this shifts with other people, because it's a conviction. It's not always convenient. But we cannot lead with convenience. Because conviction, see, when people look at you and ridicule you, when they look at you and criticize you, when they mock you, if your finger is up in the air trying to catch the latest and the greatest wind, you'll get blown all over the place. And after 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, you're not even going to know what you stood for. Okay? Now, let me make a reference here to another book by Chris Lowney. And this is just simply as an illustration. So again, I'm going to make reference to our Catholic brothers and sisters, and you deal with it, because I don't want to have to go defend it every time I make mention of it. Chris Lowney, the writer of this book, a few years back when Pope Francis was named Pope, I know right where I was when it happened. I was actually in I think I was in Berlin, Germany, with a group of vineyard leaders, and we were having dinner, and it came across all our phones that the Catholic Church had chose a pope. He was Argentinian, and he was a Jesuit. And I cheered, because I like Argentina, I like Jesuits, and I know that part of the body of Christ needed and needs a good leader. Lowney took that opportunity, being, as I've told you already in this class, Lowney was at one point a seminarian training to be a Jesuit, but praying the prayer of indifference, not my will but yours be done, that we covered in the last class. He did not go into the priesthood even though that was his training. He ended up getting cross-trained and went and became a world banker and became the general manager of J.P. Morgan and managed trillions of dollars. So he's a pretty smart guy. But after 17 years of leading J.P. Morgan, he retired. Now he's worked with Catholic Charities, and he's worked with foundations, and he's an award-winning author. But so Lowney has written a book on Pope Francis, and the title of it, I want to give you the title, is Pope Francis, and here's the tagline: Why He Leads the Way He Leads. Why He leads. And what he's saying is, why does Pope Francis do the things that he does? We could say the same thing about politicians, industrial CEOs, or scientists, or you, me. Why does he do the things he does? Well, Lowney, he basically, it's not a large book, but what he builds his argument basically by saying he has no choice to do the things that he does. Like, let me give you some examples. It was not a public relation move for Francis to ride around in a little Fiat when he came to Washington, D.C., and New York, and he came in Philadelphia when he was here in the United States. It wasn't a publicity move for everybody to say, oh, look how humble he is. He had been doing that for years. It wasn't a publicity stunt when he chose not to live in the papal palace at the Vatican, instead lives in a small apartment. It's not a public relations thing that he's trying to do when he takes public transportation, or when he stops the motorcade, gets out and picks up an autistic child or a crippled child, or it's not a publicity stunt when he stops and he washes the feet of a Muslim woman. That's not a publicity stunt. That's all he can do because that's what's on his inside. He's leading now, hundreds of millions of followers. He's leading in a thing that is at the very core of who he is. None of that surprises. Of course he picks up the handicapped child. Of course he washes the feet of people. Of course he will listen to the poor and talk to the poor. And that's all. Why? Because that's the way he rolls. You catching my drift? You understand it? So this is, and I just use him as an example. We could say, some names that you would know. Rick Warren. Why does Rick Warren say the things that he says? Why does he minister the way he ministers? Because that's what's on his inside. Why does Barack Obama lead in this way? Why does this man lead in this way? Why did John F. Kennedy lead in this way? They led from their core. Why was Mother Teresa, why would this little 4'10" Albanian Catholic nun, why did she make prime ministers shiver? Why could she could dress down the prime ministers and presidents? Why could she actually do that? Why could she go toe-to-toe with the most brilliant intellectuals? Because she led from her core. Why did she say, why would she want to live her life having people die in her arms? Why? Because that's who she is. That's who she was. She couldn't do any, you ever heard this phrase? She couldn't help herself. And there's great consequence and great reward for that. That's a huge price. But this thing of knowing who we are and how and why we are. And again, I think that's part of, and I'm making reference to past material in your class with Steve Summerall on spiritual formation. If you would, I'd like you to open your Bibles to 1 Samuel. I want to read a very familiar story. And I'm willing to pay a little bit of a price of reading it simply because I just feel it's important, okay? So you know the story, but I'm going to read it because I want to go through it methodically. 1 Samuel 17, 31 to 50. So you can open your Bibles, turn on your devices, and let me read it. When the words which David spoke were heard, they told them to Saul, and he sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with these Philistines." I'll do it. I'll go fight. He saw the taunting, he saw the mocking, and he had already said, "Is there not a cause?" And he sees the army, the Jewish army, the Israeli army. They're just this big old bully is just making these guys tremble. David steps up. Little David, shepherd boy, steps up. It says, he says, "Let no man's heart fail on account of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Boy, I'd love to park there. I just don't have time. Then Saul said to David, "You're not able to go against a Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, while he has been a warrior from his youth." How's that for an encouragement? Pee-wee, you will get killed. But David said to Saul, "Your servant was tending his father's sheep when a lion or a bear came and took a lamb from the flock. I went out after him, and I attacked him and rescued it from his mouth. And when he rose up against me, I seized him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has taunted the armies of the living God." And David said, "The Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear, he will deliver me from the hand of the Philistine." And Saul said to David, "Go, may the Lord be with you." Good luck, Pee-wee. Go do it. Then Saul, now here's this is the whole crux of this. Here's the issue. Here's the issue for leaders right here. Right here. This will deliver you from years and years of frustration. Then Saul clothed David with his garments and put on a bronze helmet on his head, and he clothed him with armor. David girded his sword over his armor and tried to walk. Boy, guys, this is not a Sunday school lesson. I have watched men and women walk away from God-given assignments because of this issue right here. The assignment was right, but they were trying to do it with somebody else's stuff. Somebody else's conviction, somebody else's gifting, somebody else's passion, somebody else's makeup. Who are you and what are you about? David girded his sword over his arm and tried to walk, for he had not tested them. He had never had that stuff on. That was not his gig. He was out watching. He knew how to fight. He knew how to do what he was about to do, but he couldn't do it with that person's armor. David says to Saul, and I emphasize, I cannot go with these, for I have not tested them. And David took them off. I can't fight with your armor. I can't use your breastplate. I can't use your helmet. I can't use your sword. I don't know how to do that. But he says, verse 40, he took his stick in his hand and chose for him 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in the shepherd's bag which he had, even in his pouch. And his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now, I know you know this. I want it read. I want it read into our spirits. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with the shield bearer in front of him. And when the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him. He disdained him. For he was but a youth and ruddy with a handsome appearance. The Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, come to me and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. Then David said to the Philistine, no, you come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I'll strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, and all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. Then it happened, when the Philistines rose and came and drew near to meet David, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag and took from it a stone and slung it, struck the Philistine on the forehead, and the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell on his face to the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him, but there was no sword in David's hand. That was his Modo De Proceder. That's the way he did it. That's the way he rolled. He didn't roll with a bronze helmet. He didn't roll. He wasn't in somebody else's lane. And the next class, I'm gonna actually come right back to this and keep working at this. Why? The why in what you do. Why? And like I say, this fits so many genres. Whether you're in your house, in the hospital, at the factory, at the PTA, at your community groups, or whatever, wherever this goes, you have to have an internal compass. And boy, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, in our countries. Now I'm doing this taping from the United States. But in the country you live in the reality you live in what you're facing, I don't know of a time when the world needs more and more than to have leaders who lead from their core, not from prevailing winds. that have deep and profound convictions that no matter what taunting comes, we do not change the battle. I've often said that in a lifetime of mission study for myself, that the methodologies from where we started and where I started and what I've learned over the last 4 decades missiologically, we've gone adjusting as we go, the methodologies and etc. So I never get lost in the methodologies. You know, you come up with a better widget and I'll buy it, okay, methodologically. But the message is the message of the kingdom of God. And then the core, so this is why when it says lay hands on no man suddenly, you don't take a neophyte and you put him at the front of the battle. Why? Doesn't even have a battle plan. It's going to get himself killed and get others killed with him. And it's not just because, you know, they might have success and it'll blow their head up. That happens too. What is this all about? Because leaders lead from the core, and if there's no core, where are you leading? And sometimes we think that this is something you can take in a 3-month course or a 1-year course or 2-year course. Excuse me. Well, leadership can be released harmoniously with the level of experience. You don't start out an experienced leader, so you may start with very small sphere of influence. That will be the next class we'll talk about. But the biggest thing here, the Modo De Proceder that you've been reading about in your material, you know, let me just introduce you to another book in closing out this class. It's Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership, written by a lady, Ruth Haley Barton, she's one of the founders and the director of the Transforming Center in Chicago, in the United States. But in this fabulous, fabulous book, I cannot recommend a better book right now, today on the market, than this book right here. But in there, in one part, she tells the story of the CEO, the founder actually of Starbucks. And that he grew up with a father who had 30 different blue-collar jobs. And he watched how his father struggled in life, the way he was treated by companies that you know, hey, there's the job. If you don't like the job, there's 30 people that want your job. Growing up in that and seeing the indignity in that, he swore he grew up in that. It sort of like formed inside of him something of justice, formed an inside a conviction on how you treat people. And some of the core things that you find in the Starbucks brand comes from what he experienced as a boy growing up in a blue-collar home, and how indignant or the treatment of his father as a blue-collar worker. It's a very interesting read. But you look at Starbucks and you have to understand that they're not just selling a cup of coffee. If you really dig in, and you can look at this around the globe, it comes from a conviction and an idea and something they really wanted to do, and they'll go adjust, but they're doing a lot more. He said he wanted to create a company where people could work in dignity. It's a fascinating. I don't have time to unpack all of that. It's on page 75. If you're reading in Ruth Haley Barton's book, I'll reference Ruth Haley Barton quite a bit from here on in this material. So, let me give you a quick conclusion here. Again, and I'm going to say it in the next class. We're going to come at it from another angle. But there is Ignatian for 500 years. And because we're using this religious order, if it was a different religious order, like, you know, it just happens to be an order of men, but now the spiritual exercises have influenced it's men and women. But I don't want to get into that whole debate. I think most of the world knows my take on that. But how is it that for 500 years these guys have stayed on course? And I'm going to bring that up in another class. So anyways, there's a lot to discuss in that. Enjoy the cohort. Throw this around a little bit. Look at whoever's beside you and say, what armor are you keeping on that's really not yours? And how is it hindering you? Boy, I'm going to dive into this a little more in the next class. So have a great week.